The sun hung low in the sky, casting a golden glow over the city streets. Cars honked impatiently. Pedestrians hurried along, lost in their own worlds, and the rhythm of life pulsed as usual. But in the middle of all that noise and movement, a frail old man stood at the edge of a busy intersection, gripping his cane tightly. His weathered face showed a hint of worry as he hesitated, his eyes scanning the road ahead. The crosswalk light flickered, counting down the seconds, yet he remained frozen in place. Emma, who had just finished her shift at the cafe down the street, noticed him while waiting for the light to change. She wasn't in a rush. There was nowhere urgent to be, no pressing plans, just a quiet evening ahead. But something about the old man caught her attention. Maybe it was the way he clutched his cane, or the slight tremble in his hand as he adjusted his glasses. Maybe it was the way people walked past him without a second glance, too wrapped up in their own lives to notice. Whatever it was, she felt a pull in her chest, a silent nudge telling her to do something. The light changed, and without hesitation, Emma stepped forward. "Would you like some help?" she asked gently, offering her arm. The old man turned his head, his eyes filled with surprise, then softened into gratitude. "Oh, my dear, that would be wonderful," he murmured, his voice a little shaky. With careful steps, Emma guided him across, matching his slow pace. Cars idled at the red light, and for a moment, it felt like the whole city had paused for them. Pedestrians streamed by, barely noticing, but to Emma, it felt significant. This small act of kindness, in a world that often seemed too busy to care. As they reached the other side, the old man let out a soft sigh of relief. "Thank you, young lady," he said, looking at her with kind, tired eyes. "It's no problem at all," she replied with a smile. "Are you headed somewhere specific?" He nodded slowly, as if debating something in his mind. Then, after a pause, he said, "Just home. I don't get out much anymore. These streets, they move too fast for me." Emma felt a pang of sympathy. She didn't know his story, but in that moment, she wished she did. Before she could say anything else, the man reached into his coat pocket and pulled out something small, pressing it into her hand. "For you," he said, his voice carrying a mysterious warmth. Emma looked down at her palm, confused. It wasn't money or anything ordinary. It was an old key, worn with time, cool against her skin. She blinked. "What's this for?" The old man smiled, his eyes twinkling with something unreadable. "You'll see," he said simply. Then, before she could ask more, he tipped his hat and shuffled away, disappearing into the crowd. Emma stood there for a moment, the key resting in her hand, her heart beating just a little faster than before. What had just happened? And what was this key for? She turned it over, running her thumb along the ridges, her mind racing with questions. Who was that man? Why had he given this to her? And most importantly, what was she supposed to do with it? She had no idea that this small moment, this simple act of kindness, was about to change her life in ways she could never have imagined. Emma turned the key over in her palm, staring at it as if it would somehow reveal its secrets. The weight of it felt oddly significant, but she had no idea why. She looked up, scanning the busy street for any sign of the old man, but he was already gone, swallowed by the crowd. A strange feeling settled in her chest. Curiosity mixed with unease. Why had he given this to her? And what was she supposed to do with it? Shaking her head, she slipped the key into her pocket and continued walking home. The thought lingered in her mind all evening as she went about her usual routine. She made a quick dinner, scrolled through her phone absent-mindedly, but her thoughts kept drifting back to the encounter. The man's face, his knowing smile, The way he had simply walked away without an explanation. It was all so strange. She took the key out again, studying it under the warm glow of her kitchen light. It was old, definitely not for anything modern, like a car or an apartment. The edges were slightly worn, the metal cool against her fingertips. There was a small engraving on the side, barely visible. She squinted, tracing the letters with her thumb. R and S. It didn't mean anything to her, but somehow, it felt important. The next morning, Emma couldn't shake the feeling that she needed to find out more. She retraced her steps to where she had met the old man, hoping she might see him again, but there was no sign of him. She even stopped by a nearby bench, pretending to check her phone while discreetly watching people pass by. Nothing. She sighed, feeling silly for being so fixated on a random encounter. Maybe it was just an old key. He didn't need any more. Maybe it meant nothing at all. But deep down, she couldn't let it go. Later that day, Emma mentioned the encounter to her friend, Leah, while they were having coffee. "That's so weird," Leah said, stirring her drink thoughtfully. "Did he say anything else?" Emma shook her head. "Just that I'd see." "But what does that even mean?" Leah leaned in slightly. "What if it's some kind of treasure hunt? Like, maybe he left you something, and you have to find out where the key goes." Emma laughed. "I doubt that." "Okay, but think about it." Leah pressed. "If some random old man gave you a key, it has to open something, right? And those letters, R and S, they could be a clue." Emma hesitated. She hadn't really considered that. Could Leah be right? That night, she searched online for anything related to R and S in the city. A few businesses popped up, some law, firms, even an old bookstore, but nothing stood out. She was about to give up when she stumbled across something that made her heart skip a beat. R&S Antiques, established 1948. It was a small antique shop on the other side of town. The website looked outdated, barely functional, but the name, R&S, was too much of a coincidence to ignore. The next day, Emma decided to check it out. As she arrived, she found herself standing in front of a quiet, unassuming shop with large wooden doors and dusty display windows, filled with old clocks, typewriters, and trinkets from another time. A small bell jingled as she stepped inside. The place smelled of aged paper and polished wood, and shelves lined the walls, packed with all sorts of oddities. An older woman behind the counter looked up, adjusting her glasses. "Can I help you?" she asked. Emma hesitated before pulling out the key. "I know this might sound strange, but I was given this by an old man a few days ago. He didn't tell me much, but it has RNSN on it. And I found this place." The woman's eyes flickered with something. Recognition, maybe surprise. She took a step closer, glancing at the key in Emma's hand. "Who gave this to you?" she asked, her voice quieter now. Emma shifted uneasily. "I don't actually know his name. He was elderly, wore a hat, used a cane." The woman's lips parted slightly, as if she were about to say something, but then she stopped herself. Instead, she gestured for Emma to follow. She led Emma to the back of the shop, past rows of old furniture and cabinets filled with forgotten treasures. In the farthest corner, there was a tall wooden chest, its surface scratched with age. The woman pulled a key from a drawer and unlocked the chest, rummaging through its contents before pulling out an old photograph. She handed it to Emma. Emma's breath caught in her throat. It was the old man. He was younger in the picture, standing in front of the very shop they were in now, smiling beside another man. "That's Richard," the woman said softly. "And the man beside him was my father, Samuel." Emma looked up in confusion. "Richard?" The woman nodded. "Richard was my father's best friend. They built this shop together decades ago. But after my father passed away, Richard stopped coming around. I haven't seen him in years." Emma's fingers tightened around the photo. "So why would he give me this key?" The woman sighed. "I don't know, but if he did, it must mean something." A chill ran down Emma's spine. She looked at the key again, her heart pounding. What had she just gotten herself into? Emma stared at the old photograph, her mind spinning. She had expected maybe a small mystery, a forgotten story, but this was something deeper. The woman, whose name she soon learned was Margaret, placed a hand on the wooden chest beside them. "If Richard gave you that key, he must have meant for you to find something," Margaret said softly. Emma hesitated, then held out the key. "Do you know what it unlocks?" Margaret took a deep breath, then nodded. She led Emma to the back of the room, where an old cabinet stood, its surface worn but still sturdy. The key trembled slightly in Emma's fingers as she placed it into the lock. With a quiet click, the door creaked open. Inside there was only one thing, a small wooden box. Emma carefully lifted it out and set it on a nearby table. Margaret watched in silence as Emma opened the lid. Inside, neatly stacked, were old letters, dozens of them, some yellowed with age. Tied together with a faded blue ribbon, tucked beneath them, was a small velvet pouch. Emma picked it up and loosened the string, gasping when she saw what was inside. A delicate gold locket. She turned to Margaret, whose eyes were glassy with emotion. "What is all this?" Margaret reached for one of the letters, running her fingers over the paper as if touching an old memory. These are letters my father wrote to Richard, but never sent. And that locket, it belonged to my mother." Emma swallowed, confused. "But why would Richard give this to me?" Margaret exhaled slowly. "I think he wanted to make things right. After my father passed, Richard distanced himself. I always thought he was just grieving, but maybe he was carrying guilt. Maybe he felt like he had unfinished business, and somehow he saw you as the person who could bring this back to me." Emma's chest tightened. She thought back to the old man's eyes, the way he had looked at her when he handed her the key. It wasn't just a random act. He had chosen her for a reason. "I don't understand," she said quietly. "Why me?" Margaret smiled, though there was sadness in it. "Sometimes the right people come into our lives at the right time. Maybe he saw kindness in you. Maybe he knew you wouldn't ignore it." Emma looked down at the locket, feeling its weight in her palm. It was such a simple object, yet it held so much history, so much meaning. Margaret reached over and squeezed Emma's hand. "Thank you," she whispered, "for not ignoring him, for helping him." Emma felt an unexpected wave of emotion rise in her chest. She had thought she was just helping an old man cross the street, but in doing so, she had helped him find peace. That evening, as she walked home, the city lights flickering around her, Emma felt different, like the world had shifted in a quiet, meaningful way. She thought about Richard, about the choices we make, the regrets we carry, and how sometimes fate places the right people in our path at just the right moment. She reached into her pocket, running her fingers over the now empty keyring. The mystery was solved, but somehow she knew she would never forget the feeling of that key in her hand. The weight of an untold story waiting to be discovered, and maybe, just maybe, she would start paying more attention to the little moments, because sometimes they turn out to be the most important ones of all.